At a lively family gathering in Lusaka, Chisomo felt proud as she shared her idea for a small business she had been dreaming about for months. She imagined making eco-friendly packaging, something practical yet kind to the environment. But before she could finish, her uncle, Mr. Tembo, one of the wealthiest traders in the city, laughed loudly and pointed at her. "A silly girl with no brains for business," he said, as everyone around the table chuckled. Chisomo felt a wave of heat rush through her body, embarrassment, anger, and sadness all at once. For a moment, she wanted to run away, hide, and cry. But then something shifted inside her. Instead of letting the words crush her, she felt a quiet fire ignite in her chest. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, but she made a promise to herself that day. She would come back stronger, smarter, and more determined than anyone could imagine. The humiliation became fuel. Each laugh and mocking word a spark she tucked deep into her heart. That evening, as the party went on and her uncle continued boasting about his successes, Chisomo sat alone for a few minutes, thinking. She pictured herself standing somewhere far in the future, not just succeeding but proving her uncle wrong. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing that she could build something real, something that mattered. That day, in the middle of laughter that stung like fire, a seed of determination was planted, a seed that would one day grow into an unstoppable force. Her uncle had thought he was crushing her dreams. He didn't know he had just lit the spark that would change everything. After the fire inside her was lit by her uncle's cruel words, Chisomo knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. She had a vision for her eco-friendly packaging business, but the world didn't seem ready to give her a chance. She went to banks, hoping for a small loan, and walked into offices with careful business plans tucked under her arm. Each time, she was met with polite rejection or outright dismissal. Too risky, they said. Not enough experience. Her own relatives, the ones she had thought might cheer her on, shook their heads and whispered that she was chasing a dream that would never come true. But Chisomo refused to give up. With no investors and no safety net, she started small. Using scraps of recycled cardboard, discarded materials, and a few coins she had saved, she made her first batch of packaging. She carried them to the crowded markets of Kitwe, setting up a tiny stall where she had to fight for space among dozens of vendors shouting to sell their goods. People glanced at her products, shook their heads, and walked away. Some laughed, thinking a young woman could never survive in the tough business world. Even the constant heat, the noise, and the jostling crowds couldn't shake her determination. Every night, after the market emptied and the city fell quiet, Chisomo sat under the dim light of a flickering candle, sketching new designs, refining her ideas, and making countless phone calls to suppliers. She would bargain for every price, explain her vision over and over, and sometimes wait hours just for someone to return a call. She learned about packaging materials, printing techniques, and customer preferences the hard way, often making mistakes that cost her time and money. Yet she refused to see them as failures. Each one was a lesson, a stepping stone toward something bigger. Even though everyone thought she would fail, Chisomo kept her head down and worked. She didn't boast, and she didn't ask for sympathy. Each small sale, each tiny bit of progress, felt like proof that her dream could exist in the real world. She drew strength from the memory of her uncle's laughter, turning it into a quiet determination that no rejection or insult could erase. Slowly, her persistence started to take shape. The scraps of cardboard became neat, carefully designed packages. The small stall in the market began to attract curious customers who returned, not just for her products, but for the care and creativity she put into each one. Nobody outside her could see the hours of struggle, the sleepless nights, or the doubts that crept in, the struggle nobody saw coming. But Chisomo knew it was working. Piece by piece, she was building not just a business, but a future that would one day prove everyone wrong. For months, Chisomo's small stall in the Kitwe market seemed like a tiny speck in a huge world. Every day, she woke before dawn, carefully arranging her handmade packaging, greeting customers with a smile, and explaining why her products were different, better for the environment, carefully crafted, and made with care. Most days, only a few people stopped to look, and most walked away without buying anything. She cleaned up at the end of the day, packed away her scraps, and carried the weight of doubt and exhaustion home with her. Yet she never stopped believing that her work mattered. Then, one morning, a phone call changed everything. A representative from a supermarket chain in Ndola, hundreds of kilometers away, asked if she could supply packaging for their stores. Chisomo couldn't believe it at first. She had spent so long struggling to make just enough for her small stall, and now a company wanted a huge order. Her heart raced as she thought about the possibilities. This was the break she had been praying for. She spent the next few days working tirelessly, preparing samples, arranging materials, and negotiating logistics. Every detail mattered, because she knew that this was the moment that could turn months of struggle into a real opportunity. When the first shipment went out, it felt like a dream. The supermarket displayed her products, and customers began to notice. Word spread quickly. People talked about the young woman who had turned scraps into something useful, who cared about the environment while still making her products practical and beautiful. Orders started coming from other stores, other towns, even other provinces. Chisomo realized that her small stall was no longer enough. She needed space, staff, and proper equipment. With the little money she had saved, she rented a small factory, hired a handful of workers, and began producing larger batches. From one humble market stall, her business began to grow into a real operation. What had begun as a joke in her uncle's living room now inspired young women across Zambia. Students, aspiring entrepreneurs, and even women who had been told they couldn't succeed began reaching out to her, asking for advice, encouragement, and mentorship. She shared her story openly, the long nights, the failures, the rejections, and in return they called her a role model, someone who had turned humiliation into opportunity. Her journey became more than just a business. It became a symbol of resilience and possibility. Even Chisomo herself was amazed by how far she had come. She often thought back to those early days under candlelight, wondering how she had found the strength to keep going. Every sale, every order, every message from a young woman who said she felt inspired was proof that her struggle had been worth it. The dust of the market, the heat, the rejection, it all seemed distant now. What had started small had grown into something far bigger than she had imagined, and it was only the beginning. While Chisomo's small business was quietly growing, her Uncle Tembo's empire, once seen as untouchable, was starting to show cracks. He ran his retail stores the same way he had for decades, relying on old habits and stubborn pride. When new technologies arrived, digital payment systems, online orders, and modern inventory tools, he scoffed at them. "Why do we need all that nonsense?" he would say, waving away suggestions from his manager. Customers, however, were changing. They wanted convenience, speed, and products that reflected modern life. Tembo's refusal to adapt slowly began to push them away. His staff noticed too. Many loyal employees felt frustrated because they couldn't introduce new ideas or improve processes without facing his mockery. Tembo's greed didn't help. He cut corners to maximize short-term profits, underpaying suppliers and ignoring quality control. Soon, deliveries were late, shelves were empty, and the few customers who came in left dissatisfied. Rumors spread that his business, once a model of success in Lusaka, was now losing ground. Yet he remained blind, convinced that his reputation alone would keep the empire safe. What Tembo didn't realize was that some of his clients were quietly moving toward Chisomo's business. The supermarkets and small shops he had once relied on for bulk orders were now impressed by her fresh approach, fair dealings, and commitment to quality. They appreciated her attention to detail, her willingness to innovate, and her respectful relationships with suppliers. Orders that might have once gone to Tembo's stores now went to Chisomo's factory instead. It was a slow but steady bleed of his empire, unnoticed by him, hidden beneath the familiar rhythm of his office. Even as his business faltered, Tembo continued to laugh at Chisomo whenever he heard her name. He assumed that her venture was still a small, unimportant project. He didn't see the network she was building, the clients she was winning, or the reputation she was quietly earning across Zambia. Every laugh he threw at her only fueled her determination, while his stubbornness and pride blinded him to the threat growing right under his nose. Tembo's empire, built over decades of work, began to wobble because he refused to adapt. The irony was sharp. The same niece he had mocked, whom he assumed would fail, was steadily reshaping the business landscape around him. Chisomo's rise was not flashy or loud at first, but it was relentless. While he laughed and clung to old ways, she was quietly proving that innovation, persistence, and integrity could topple even the mightiest of traditional powers. By the time Tembo started noticing that something was wrong, it was already too late. The empire he had relied on for so long was no longer untouchable, and he had underestimated the very person he had humiliated. Every missed opportunity, every neglected innovation, every insult he had thrown at Chisomo was now part of the reason his empire was cracking, piece by piece, silently, while she quietly rose. When the annual Trade Expo in Johannesburg opened, it was buzzing with people from all over Africa. Large banners hung from every wall, and each company tried to outshine the others. Tembo arrived that morning with his usual swagger, expecting to command attention, as he always had. He believed his wealth and experience made him untouchable. But as he walked through the expo hall, something stopped him in his tracks. There it was, Chisomo's company name, bold and bright, shining on the biggest billboard in the entire hall. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The stall below the billboard was alive with visitors. People were snapping pictures, asking questions, and talking excitedly about her products. For the first time, Tembo didn't feel amusement or superiority. His chest tightened, and a creeping unease spread through him. How had she grown so fast? How was she here, in this space he had always imagined as his domain? Tembo tried to act casual, walking toward the crowd, but the reaction around him was not what he expected. Old partners, suppliers, and even competitors who had once respected him turned their attention toward Chisomo. They greeted her warmly, shook her hand, and asked for advice. Some whispered praises in the corners of the hall. Tembo's presence seemed irrelevant, as if he were invisible. The laughter he had once directed at her, the pride he had taken in his wealth and influence, now felt hollow. Every smile she received, every nod of respect she earned, chipped away at the empire of confidence he had built around himself. He moved through the crowd, trying to regain composure, but everywhere he looked, she was the center of attention. Suppliers he had long mistreated came to her, seeking partnerships, and clients he had taken for granted were asking about her products. Panic began to replace the arrogance that had carried him for so many years. He realized, maybe too late, that the world had changed and that Chisomo had changed with, grown stronger, smarter, and far more admired than he could have imagined. Even a single glance at her expression sent a sharp pang through him. She stood there, calm and confident, smiling politely as she answered questions and greeted visitors. There was no gloating, no revenge in her eyes, just quiet authority. Every handshake and every compliment she received was a reminder that she had achieved what he had dismissed as impossible. Tembo's mind raced, calculating how her rise might affect his business, his reputation, and the partnerships he had always relied on. By the end of the day, the laughter that had once defined him was gone. In its place was a gnawing worry, a sense that his old world was slipping out of his hand. He had mocked his niece, believing her too small, too inexperienced, and too young to matter. Now, in the bright lights of Johannesburg, with her name towering over him on a massive billboard and her influence visible in every conversation around her, he understood. She was no longer the one to be underestimated. While Tembo wandered the trade expo in shock, unaware of the forces quietly working against him, Chisomo was building her empire in a different, quieter way. She didn't just focus on customers. She noticed the people behind the scenes, the suppliers and partners who had kept Tembo's business running for years. She knew many of them had been underpaid, ignored, or treated unfairly. While he laughed at her and dismissed her efforts, she quietly reached out to them, offering fair contracts, timely payments, and respect. It started small. She would call a supplier who had been waiting months for Tembo's payment and say, "I want to work with you. Let's build something together." She listened carefully to their frustrations, understood their needs, and offered deals that finally felt fair. Word spread quickly. These suppliers had spent years bending to Tembo's demands, but Chisomo treated them like partners, valuing their time and work. Slowly, they began to trust her. One by one, the contracts Tembo had relied on for decades began to crumble. Orders that had once gone to his stores were quietly diverted to Chisomo's factory. Tembo noticed delays in deliveries, missing products, and disgruntled suppliers, but he couldn't understand why it was happening. He blamed bad luck or mismanagement, never imagining that his own niece, the one he had humiliated at that family gathering, was the reason behind the unraveling of his empire. Chisomo worked with precision. She didn't make grand announcements or public threats. She moved quietly, methodically, letting the results speak for themselves. Each supplier she signed strengthened her business and weakened Tembo's at the same time. She was building a network of loyalty, respect, and efficiency that her uncle had ignored or dismissed. What he had seen as a small, naive startup was actually a carefully planned engine, growing stronger with every contract she secured. The irony was sharp. Tembo had mocked her, laughed at her ideas, and assumed she would fail. Meanwhile, she had taken the very people who had kept his empire alive and turned them into allies for her own growth. His arrogance and neglect were his undoing. He still didn't see it, still clung to the belief that his wealth and reputation would protect him, but each day, the cracks widened. By the time he started to notice the pattern, much of the damage was already done. Chisomo had dismantled the foundation of his business quietly, without fanfare, without confrontation. Her victory was in the details, in the trust she built, and in the fairness she offered where he had offered none. The niece he had mocked was no longer just surviving. She was quietly rewriting the rules of the game and taking over, one contract at a time. By the time Tembo's business hit rock bottom, the city was buzzing with whispers. Rumors spread that an anonymous buyer had stepped in, someone wealthy and determined, ready to rescue the failing empire. Tembo, desperate to salvage what was left, tried to ignore the gossip, clinging to the hope that the company could still survive under his management. But deep down, he knew he was cornered. Suppliers were gone, customers had shifted to competitors, and his once loyal staff had left in frustration. Every day was a battle, and the battle was already lost. The day of the signing arrived at Lusaka's tallest skyscraper. Tembo entered the gleaming glass building, clutching his papers and trying to mask his anxiety with a forced smile. The room was quiet, tension hanging thick in the air. The representatives of the supposed buyer were already seated, and Tembo barely concealed his irritation at the secrecy surrounding the transaction. He assumed it was a foreign investor, someone with deep pockets but little understanding of his local business. He was ready to negotiate, ready to assert his authority, confident that his name still carried weight. Then the veil was lifted. Tembo froze. Standing across the table, calm and confident, was Chisomo, the niece he had humiliated years ago. His heart skipped a beat, his face drained of color. She had purchased his entire empire in cash. Every store, every contract, every piece of property he had once relied on was now hers. There was no room to argue, no way to reclaim control. The niece he had mocked, dismissed, and doubted had quietly prepared for this moment, building the strength, network, and resources to take everything he had for granted. The room went silent as she smiled politely, acknowledging Tembo without malice. Her presence alone carried authority. Tembo, who had once laughed at her in front of the family, now realized the full scale of what he had lost. He was no longer the one in control. The empire he had built with arrogance and greed had passed into the hands of someone who had started from scraps, someone who had been underestimated every step of the way. Chisomo signed the papers with steady hands, finalizing what Tembo had never imagined. Every signature was a reminder of the years of persistence, hard work, and clever strategy that had led her here. There was no drama, no public confrontation, just quiet, undeniable triumph. Tembo could barely meet her eyes. He had spent a lifetime thinking he knew the rules of business, but she had rewritten them silently, skillfully, and with patience. When the signing was complete, Tembo sat back in disbelief. The niece he had mocked was now the owner of everything he had once held as untouchable. For her, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction, a culmination of years of struggle, innovation, and unwavering belief. For him, it was the shocking realization that power could shift, and that underestimating someone, even a family member, could cost everything. The day of the final press conference arrived, and the room was packed. Reporters from all over Zambia and beyond had gathered, cameras flashing and microphones poised. Chisomo walked up to the podium with calm confidence, her presence commanding attention without a word. The story of her rise, from a young girl mocked by her own family to the owner of one of the country's most talked-about businesses, had already made headlines. But now, everyone wanted to hear her speak, to understand how she had done what so many thought impossible. Reporters leaned forward, eager for a quote, a soundbite, anything that could capture the drama of her journey. "What do you say to those who doubted you?" one shouted from the crowd. Chisomo paused, a quiet smile on her lips. She let her gaze sweep across the room, but it lingered for a moment on her uncle, Tembo, seated behind her. The man who had laughed at her, dismissed her ideas, and assumed she would fail now sat in silence, humbled and unaccustomed to the feeling of being overshadowed. His empire, once untouchable, had passed into her hand. Then, with steady voice and clarity, Chisomo answered. "Laughter is fuel," she said, her words echoing across the room. "Thank you, uncle, for giving me the fire to build an empire." The reporters erupted in applause, cameras snapping nonstop. There was no bitterness in her tone, no sense of revenge, only honesty, gratitude, and the quiet triumph of someone who had turned humiliation into strength. Her message was clear. The mockery, the doubt, and the rejection had not broken her, they had built her. The room was electric, but Chisomo remained composed. She shared glimpses of her journey, the long nights under candlelight, the endless calls to suppliers, the moments when she wanted to give up but didn't. She spoke not only of her success but of the lessons she had learned, persistence, integrity, and the courage to believe in herself when no one else did. Young women in the audience listened with wide eyes, inspired by her honesty and resilience. Tembo, sitting quietly behind her, couldn't look away. The niece he had humiliated had done what he could never imagine. She had taken his empire, won respect from the business world, and now commanded the admiration of everyone. For him, there was shame, yes, but also the undeniable realization that underestimating someone, especially someone who had quietly nurtured their skills and determination, could cost you everything. Chisomo stepped away from the podium with a sense of calm satisfaction. Cameras continued to click, questions still flew, but she had already made her point. She had transformed laughter and doubt into a story of triumph that would be remembered across the country. That single phrase, "laughter is fuel," captured the essence of her journey, a journey from ridicule to reverence, from struggle to ultimate victory. After the press conference and the news of her acquisition spread, Chisomo noticed a shift in her family. The same relatives who had once laughed at her ideas, dismissed her efforts, and whispered that she would never succeed now approached her with cautious smiles and hopeful eyes. They wanted jobs in her company, positions of influence, or at least a chance to be part of her growing empire. Even her uncle's own children, who had watched her struggle and once thought themselves superior, stepped forward, resumes in hand, asking to work for her. Chisomo welcomed them politely. She understood that their attitude had changed not because they suddenly valued hard work or vision, but because her success was undeniable. Their previous mockery had hurt, but she didn't let it cloud her judgment. She knew that allowing favoritism would undermine the values she had built her business on: fairness, hard work, and integrity. So she made a simple rule. Everyone, no matter who they were, would start at the bottom. Her relatives were surprised. They expected cushy positions, easy tasks, and special treatment because of family ties. Instead, Chisomo handed them basic assignments: organizing inventory, managing small shipments, assisting in the factory. No privileges, no shortcuts. At first, some grumbled, but Chisomo watched closely, guiding them when necessary, showing patience while keeping expectations high. She wanted them to understand what it took to build something real: the late nights, the careful attention to detail, and the persistence that carried her through years of struggle. For the employees who had followed her from the beginning, it was inspiring to see Chisomo treat her relatives the same way she treated everyone. No one was above the rules, and no one received preferential treatment. Her fairness built respect, even among family members who initially resisted. Slowly, they began to work harder, learning to respect the system and, in turn, her leadership. Chisomo didn't gloat or dwell on the past. She understood that people changed in different ways, and she focused on what was important: the growth and strength of her company. Despite the awkwardness and tension that came with family members now working under her, Chisomo found satisfaction in watching them grow. Her uncle's children, once spoiled by privilege, began to understand the value of effort and humility. Cousins who had mocked her ideas now saw firsthand the work required to maintain success. It was a lesson she let them learn for themselves, quietly letting their experience speak louder than words. Her family's new reality had been completely upended. The tables had turned, and the niece they had underestimated was now the one setting the rules. Chisomo's success had not only transformed her life, but also reshaped the family dynamic. She had shown that respect and effort mattered more than wealth, titles, or connections, and that even those closest to you could learn, if they were willing to start at the bottom. Chisomo's story quickly became known far beyond Lusaka. From Zambia to other countries in Africa, people talked about the young woman who had turned humiliation into triumph. Universities invited her to speak to students, eager to hear how she had started with scraps, faced endless rejection, and built a thriving business from the ground up. Young men and women listened with wide eyes as she shared her journey, her failures, and the quiet determination that had driven her every step of the way. Women's groups across the continent began to chant her name, celebrating her not just as a business leader, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. For many, she represented the courage to keep going when everyone else doubts you, the strength to transform pain into purpose, and the power of belief in oneself. Magazines ran feature stories, calling her the girl who bought laughter, a nod to the cruel words that had once ignited her fire. Her story was no longer just about family drama. It had become a legend of perseverance, creativity, and quiet revenge turned into inspiration. Chisomo herself remained grounded. She continued to work hard, improving her products, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and expanding her company. But she also made time to speak with those who needed encouragement, sharing the simple truth that every setback, every insult, every moment of doubt could be turned into fuel for growth. What had begun as a cruel joke, meant to humiliate her, ended as one of the greatest turnarounds in both family and business history. Through resilience, intelligence, and unwavering determination, Chisomo had shown that success is not just about wealth or power. It's about heart, persistence, and the courage to rise above every challenge. Her legacy was clear. Laughter, even when it hurts, can spark the fire that builds empires.